want to get going, and hopefully, if anybody joins, hopefully I'll just, make sure to frame it, just and rehash or drop or summarize. But what I want to do is the ad is just because we showed Fiddler on a movie this week in the synagogue about making a fiddler on the roof, but it has nothing to do with Fiddler on the Roof. But of course, the famous song of Fiddler on the Roof is about tradition. I'm not going to sing it, but you all have it in your head right now, the double tradition. And the great passage in all of rabbinic literature that hails the value of tradition, or the centrality of tradition, is the beginning of Pirkei Avot, the beloved book that, from the Mishnah, probably our favorite book of the Mishnah and our most familiar book of the Mishnah, gives the ethical sayings. Sometimes we call it the ethics of our fathers, or the sayings of our fathers, or the chapters of our fathers. Why it's called Pirkei Avot is an interesting question, which we won't get into tonight. But it's tempting to say, let me just say one thing on that. It's tempting to say because it begins with this opening chain of our fathers, those who passed on the tradition, not just the patriarchs from Genesis, but those who passed on the great tradition of the Torah. And the Torah probably means both the written Torah, but also the oral. No doubt it connotes also in the beginning of Pirkei Avot, the oral Torah. And this is the very famous chain of transmission in the beginning of Pirkei Avot. So I have it over here. This chain in the beginning of Pirkei Avot, I returned to it recently in some of my own scholarly projects. And I want to share some ideas, really more ideas that I've read and I thought about a bit. So that's what I want to try to do tonight. And maybe if we do a part two, I could get into other topics where I, have some of my own thoughts a little bit more. So the beginning of Pirkei Avot begins as follows. There's a lot of ground in theory I want to cover. We'll see what we can, but I also want to make sure it's clear. So the famous beginning of Pirkei Avot is as follows. Moses received the Torah at Sinai, transmitted it to Joshua, Joshua to the elders, elders to the prophets, prophets to the men of the great assembly. And then we have a saying of the men of the great assembly. They said three things. And I'm going to leave the content of the three things they said. Okay, we'll leave that. We're not going to get into the content. What I want to focus in on is this chain of transmission. This chain of transmission from Moses at Sinai to Joshua, and then from Joshua to the elders, the Skenim, from the elders to the prophets, the Nevi'im, and prophets to the men of the great assembly, right? That seems to be the bare bone chain of transmission of Pirkei Avot. And you have to appreciate this is traversing a lot of centuries, right? When you begin with Moses at Sinai, we're talking about, 13th century BCE. By the time we get to the men of the great assembly, we're at, 3rd century BCE, maybe. So we've covered about 1,000 years. So in those 1,000 years, we have a few protagonists, according to Pirkei Avot. Moses, then his beloved and, his faithful disciple, Joshua, Yoshua. And then we get a little more generic, Yoshua to a group, the Skenim, and the Skenim to the elders, and the elders to another group, prophets. Prophets seems to encompass a lot of people, right? Who's the prophets? Is that everybody from, I don't know. Abraham is called a prophet, right? So prophets might cover a lot of ground, all the way from, Abraham. Well, this is Abraham, is pre-Moses, so it wouldn't be Abraham, but I don't know who's the prophet. So, Samuel, all the way till, Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi, maybe, it's just this sort of pithy formulation, the prophets and prophets to the men of the great assembly. By the way, the men of the great assembly is a little bit mysterious. We're not sure exactly what that institution was. Historians have, banged their head and scratched their head trying to figure out when was this institution and what was its jurisdiction and what was its authority. We don't know so much. Some associated with the latest of the prophets, some associated with the period of Ezra, Nehemiah, and maybe beyond. But historically, we're really on thin ice here. We don't know very much. And then we start getting in the continuation of, I should have brought one more thing. I'm sorry I didn't bring it, my bad. Does anybody remember who is the next figure we meet in Pirkei Avot? In Pirkei Avot 1-2? There's one figure who's identified as the last of the remnant of the great assembly, Mishayarei Knesset Hagdolah. Mishayarei Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. Who is that?
Shimon ben Yochai.
Shimon HaTzadik, not Shimon bar Yochai, but Shimon HaTzadik. Okay, Shimon HaTzadik, Simon the Just, Simon the Righteous. Simon the Righteous seems to have been a figure who was in Second Temple times. So in other words, we're covering from the early biblical period of Moses all the way through First Temple times, David and beyond, all the way into Second Temple times, and we're getting late into Second Temple times. So the chain of tradition is getting us to this institution of the men of the Great Assembly, and then the next figure we encounter is Shimon HaTzadik, Simon the Just, who is Mishayarei Knesset Hagdolah, from the last of the men of the Great Assembly. After him, we go to a bit of an obscure figure, Antigonus, which sounds like a Greek name, Ish Socho. And after that, we go to the Zugot, the 5 pairs. Okay, if you don't know all of this offhand, that's fine. You could open up your Pirkei Avot. You're invited nowadays, no excuse. It's all on the web. It's all, you Google Pirkei Avot or Ethics of Our Fathers. And of course, it's in a prayer book also, because there's the custom to learn Pirkei Avot in Shabbat afternoon, actually this time of year. So Pirkei Avot, again, let's just summarize. I haven't said that much so far. What I've said is the opening of Pirkei Avot is a very famous chain of transmission of the Torah, all the way from Moses, getting us well into the Second Temple period. The chain actually just has a few links, because some links in the chain seem to cover a lot of generations. So we have Moses, Joshua, God obviously is in the background, and handing off to Moses, Moses to Joshua, Joshua, then we have to the elders, then we have to the prophets, and then eventually we get to this institution, the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, men of the Great Assembly, which we probably associate with some period in Second Temple times. Second Temple times, 5th century BC, 4th century BC, etc., all the way till 1st century CE, but we're not there yet because Shimon HaTzadik is about 3rd century BC evidently, okay? That's what we have in the beginning of Pirkei Avot. What's very interesting about Pirkei Avot, and a little of a mystery, is why is this at the beginning of Pirkei Avot? Why is this not at the beginning of the entire Mishnah, right? That's a bit of a good question. The beginning of the Mishnah is not Pirkei Avot. The beginning of the Mishnah is Masechet Brachot, Tractate Brachot. And Tractate Brachot just dives right into the halachot of Shema, reciting evening Shema. So the Mishnah sort of begins without an introduction. A lot of books in the ancient world didn't have an introduction. What's fascinating is Pirkei Avot does seem to have an introduction, and its introduction is a chain of transmission that you would think would be a good introduction to the entire rabbinic Mishnah, right? So it's sort of that's a good, interesting question. Some of these things are questions I'm going to flag. I'm not going to address all these questions. Some of these questions are hard to answer also. But the question here now I'm raising is, why is this the beginning of Pirkei Avot? Why is it so important to ground the ethical sayings of Avot in the chain of transmission? Says that's not the easiest question to answer. And also, why is this not the opening to the entire Mishnah? That's also not the easiest question to answer. Now, but I want to move forward with some themes I do want to address. And, so again, let's just make sure we're all on the same page, because I'm going to go through various sources. So the beginning of Pirkei Avot is a chain of transmission of Torah. By Torah, we presumably mean written Torah, but also the oral law, right? There's no reason to think that Mishnah Avot is just focused on who got the written Torah, because you would think everybody got the written Torah. So it seems to be who's the guardian over the Torah, presumably both the written and oral law. Who are the lead figures who are responsible? Who are the guardians? And the beginning of Pirkei Avot says Moshe, Joshua, elders, prophets, and it gets to the Great Assembly, and then it gets to Simon, the just of the Great Assembly, and then it gets to somewhat obscure figures, and eventually we get to very well-known figures like Hillel and Shammai and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Okay, that's the beginning of Pirkei Avot. Now, what's interesting, if you look at Maimonides, Maimonides has a code of law, his very famous code of law, the Mishnah Torah, and he has his own introduction, but it's very clear that Maimonides' introduction is building off of Pirkei Avot. Okay, now we're not going to study this at length, but let's just see, and I think you'll see that it's building off Pirkei Avot, but it's also elaborating. So let's look at this together. Does everybody see? I just switched to Maimonides. I hope that worked. Did you see that?
Yes.
Okay, good. So Maimonides in his introduction, now we're jumping forward by, Pirkei Avot, we could date. It's a good question how to date exactly Pirkei Avot. We usually assume the Mishnah is dated to around the year 200 as an edited work. It's a bit of a scholarly debate. Is Mishnah Pirkei Avot as early, or is it a little bit later? Okay, that need not detain us here. But we have here a basically 1,000 years later, and we have the following introduction from Maimonides. All the commandments which were given to Moses on Sinai were given together with their oral explanation. So right away, Maimonides flags that we have a written Torah and also an oral. And then he starts telling us, and I skipped a little bit, you see ellipses here, but he says, Moses, our master, gave instructions to whom? So from the beginning of Pirkei Avot, we'd expect to Joshua, but actually Maimonides in his way tells something a little bit more intricate. He actually gave it to 70 elders, which makes sense, of course, because in the Torah, we hear a lot about the 70 elders. So to 70 elders, and apparently among the 70 elders or alongside of them, there were 3 figures who had even greater distinction, Elazar, Phineas, and Joshua. But then Maimonides says, from all of them, Joshua took the lead. Okay? Then who got it from Joshua? Many elders received it from Joshua. So do you see the skeleton of Pirkei Avot there? He's clearly building off of Pirkei Avot. Moses, then he gets to Joshua, but he makes it more elaborate. It wasn't just Joshua. There were other figures, but center stage was Joshua. And then Joshua hands it off to the elders. But then what does Maimonides do? He adds, Eli received it from the elders. Who's Eli? Or Eli? That's the Eli from the book of Samuel, right? The book of Samuel has a priest, a high priest named Eli. So we know from Pirkei Avot, it goes from the elders to the prophets. What does Maimonides start to do here? He starts to give us names. Eli received it from the elders and from Phineas. Samuel received it from Eli. David received it from Samuel. Right? Actually, he says from Eli and his tribunal, from Samuel and his tribunal. So here Maimonides starts to introduce new elements. Again, I don't want to make this a total class on Maimonides. I really want to use Maimonides briefly. But what do you see Maimonides is doing? It's no doubt that the skeleton which he's working with is Pirkei Avot, but Maimonides is filling it out. So instead of just saying Joshua gave it to the elders and elders gave it to the prophets, he starts elaborating. And in the prophets, he tells us Eli, Samuel, and actually says even more, Eli and his tribunal, which in Hebrew is Beit Dino, meaning Eli and his court. It wasn't just an individual. Eli had a court with him, and Samuel had a court with him, and David, meaning King David, had a court with him. And if we continued, I skipped here, he talks about Elijah and Elisha and a lot of the prophets. So he fills out. And by the way, not everybody needs the prophet. Like David, I don't think David is a prophet. David is a poet. David is a king. But Maimonides, I think, would argue he's in the period of the prophets. Prophets for Maimonides is a shorthand for a whole period of history. And Maimonides fills in blanks. And he tells us actually step by step who is in the lead. So Maimonides doesn't just like the generic formulations of Pirkei Avot. Moses, Joshua, elders, prophets, great assembly, Simon the Just. Maimonides fills it out. Okay? And actually, by the way, he also goes beyond Pirkei Avot. If you look at the very last line, he gets all the way past Pirkei Avot, past the Mishnah, all the way through the Talmud, and he ends up with Rav Ashi and Ravina, who are the great sages of the Talmud, late sages of the Talmud. So Maimonides extends the list from Moses all the way through the, not just Second Temple and then the sages of the Mishnah, but all the way through the sages of the Talmud. Now, a little bit of question you might ask is, why does Maimonides feel the need to flesh out the Pirkei Avot? Why wasn't it enough just to use the shorthand? Why did Maimonides feel the need to spell out all these generations and also to emphasize who was in it and their court? Maimonides seems to want to fill it out. So you could say Maimonides is, I know, very exact and scholarly, so he wants to fill it out, maybe. But look at the next page. This is a continuation of Maimonides. And you sort of sense a little bit more is up. Because then Maimonides, when he's done with his list, actually does something interesting. And this is what he says. Consequently, there are 40 intervening generations from Rav Ashi till Moses. Maimonides now starts to count backwards. And he says, if you count backwards from the end of the list, from the Talmud all the way back to Moses, how many generations will you find? 40. What are the 40? Rav Ashi received it from Rabbah. Rabbah received it from Rava. All the way back. David from Samuel. Samuel from Eli. Eli from Pinchas. Pinchas from Joshua. Joshua from Moses. Moses from God. Thus it established that all of them received it from the Lord God of Israel. So what impression do you get from Maimonides? I would posit something. Maimonides is telling you there were 40 generations. He labored hard, I would suggest, this is just a suggestion, to come up with 40 generations. Why 40? Here I would just throw out a conjecture. The conjecture is that we know 40 in Judaism is a significant number. It's a whole number. It's a sort of a unit, right? A unit, like Moses is up at Sinai 40 days and 40 nights, right? 40 is a providential period. In Judaism, we have different 40s, the flood, with Moses at Sinai, and other places, okay? But 40, I would suggest Maimonides is trying to make the statement that this was a providential process. It began with Moses, and it went all the way to the end of the Talmud. It's not just happenstance, who got it and who passed it on. There was a grand design, a divine plan, 40 generations. Now, you wonder, why does Maimonides need to make that point? Why is it so important to say there's a divine plan? Or it's perfect. It's not just happenstance, but there's a perfect transmission from Moses all the way to the end of the Talmud. And we could identify all the chains of the link of 40 generations. Why is this so important for Maimonides? So here we are at the realm of conjecture, but I would here embrace the conjecture. Again, this is others, I think, say this, and this is my assumption too, that Maimonides is trying to uphold the integrity of the oral law. Okay, not the written law. The written law, we have 5 books of Moses and we have 24 books of the Bible. Maimonides wants to uphold the integrity of the oral law. And he's saying there was 40 generations, a perfect process for 40 generations. Now, to gain a little more insight in what might be motivating Maimonides, let's look at another work, roughly contemporaneous, actually slightly earlier than Maimonides. And this is a book by a figure that's a little less known to us, but in his life, he was a great sage, Avraham ibn Daud, sometimes called the Rabbi Avad, the Rabad. And he wrote a book called, and note the name of the book, Sefer HaKabbalah. The book that Rabbi Avad or Ibn Daud wrote in the early 12th century, this is a little bit before Maimonides, was an entire book elaborating on this idea of a chain of transmission, which highlights that theme was an important theme in medieval times or late Gaonic, early medieval times, trying to establish tradition as having integrity, as being tradition being done in an impeccable fashion, the chain of transmission unbroken that we could trace, right? That's an important theme that apparently needs to be emphasized. And even Dawood shows us his cards here. Let's look a little bit. The purpose, why am I writing a book of tradition? Asked Ibn Dawood. By the way, just to make sure everybody's with me, what does it mean a book of tradition? The book of tradition that Ibn Dawood writes is spelling out how the oral law was transmitted, beginning with Moses and going all the way to his times. In other words, filling out the beginning of Pirkei Avot. He wrote a whole book on this. So then he explains, why am I writing a book on this? The purpose of this book of tradition is to provide students with the evidence that all teachings of our rabbis have been transmitted, each great sage and righteous man having received them from a great sage and righteous man. Thus, there were 10 generations from the prophets Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi, until Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. 5 generations of Tanaim, 7 generations of Amoraim, a grand total of 38 generations from Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi until Rabbi Yosef Halevi, who is a predecessor to Ibn Dawood. Okay, so Ibn Dawood wants us to know how many generations were there. He tells us there are 38. So don't get so tripped up. Maimonides says there are 40 from Moses until the end of Talmud. He says he's starting a different count. He's not asking for Moses. He's saying from Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi, which is the beginning of the Second Temple period. How many generations were there? And he says there are 38. Okay, so each one has their count. But in other words, why is he emphasizing 38? He's emphasizing that we can reconstruct exactly how the tradition passed. From Moses till Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi, that we know from the beginning of Avot. And from Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi until his own times, that's what he spells out in this book. And then he shows his cards. Look at the last lines. Such is not the case with the heretics. In other words, we know how tradition was passed, but the heretics don't. The fact is that Anan the wicked and his son Saul broke with him and his tradition only out of the envy that overcame them. So who's he referring to, Anan? Does anybody know who he's referring to? Even if you don't know exactly. Who is Anan?
Karaite?
He's a Karaite. Exactly, he's a Karaite. Anan was a leading Karaite. The Karaites, just to give a little background, the Karaites were Jews who have been around at least since the 10th century. Very prominent in Palestine, but also in Babylon, in other, what we call modern Iraq, and in other places, all the way up until modern times. Okay, they're actually very fascinating. Basically, they're Jews. In very modern times, there's some Karaites who I think don't see themselves as Jews, but historically, Karaites for sure were Jews. Sometimes very strict, very observant Jews, but not observant of the oral law. So they didn't keep the halakha. They kept Karaite practices. They didn't keep rabbinic practices. So Ibn Dawood, I just want to make sure everybody's with me. Ibn Dawood is emphasizing that we know the tradition as it was passed from generation to generation, beginning with Moses, all the way to the late prophets, all the way through the Talmud, all the way from the end of the Talmud up until his lifetime, up until the 12th century. He writes a book and he says, I could show you how the halakha was transmitted. And why is this so important? And in fact, he tells you, look, I could show you the 38 generations. I'm not making it up. I'll give you an account of exactly how it passed. And why is this so important? Because he's saying in his lifetime, is a significant group of Jews, Karaites, led by people like Anan and his son Saul, who broke away from tradition. And their version of Judaism has no tradition. So yes, they say they're Jews, and yes, they say they're adhering to God's word, and yes, they know their Torah. But the problem is they don't have a tradition of how to live out the Torah. We do. We meaning rabbinic Jews. We meaning halachic Jews. And that's why it's so important, says Ibn Daud. But once we have Ibn Daud, it's very tempting to extrapolate from Ibn Daud to Maimonides. Does everybody follow the argument? Maybe what animated Ibn Daud, a similar thing animated Maimonides. That Maimonides wished to emphasize in the beginning of his code of law, I'm about to tell you the halakha. And a lot of the halakha is rooted in the Torah, but has all its details are not in the Torah. What are they based on? Oral law. And what's the authority of oral law? Well, the oral law traces back to Moses at Sinai. Says Maimonides, and I'm going back to Maimonides for a second, there are 40 generations of tradition from Moses till the end of the Talmud. And Maimonides says those 40 generations, I just gave you their leading figures, and he spells them out. So we should know who they were, and he's emphasizing, I would suggest 40 to tell you it was a perfect providential process, getting from Moses till the end of the Talmud. And I think Maimonides is sort of looking around and saying, and that's what distinguishes us halachic Jews and rabbinic Jews from you Karaites, or maybe from you anybody who wants to question the authority of halakha. The authority of halakha is rooted in the revelation that Moses received at Sinai of written Torah and oral law, and its perfect transmission for 40 generations. Okay, does everybody get the basic point? So let me just summarize what we have so far. What we have so far is that the beginning of Pirkei Avot tells us a chain of transmission. When we fast forward to the 12th century, this chain of transmission seemed to be really important. And hence it was filled out and it was elaborated. People didn't just study Pirkei Avot, they embellished and filled out and fleshed out the beginning of Pirkei Avot, because they saw the beginning of Pirkei Avot as a shorthand for what is the source of, or what are the addresses of the chain of transmission to give integrity to the oral law. And the fact that they had to underscore the integrity of the oral law, I think no doubt bespeaks that there were heretics around them, people who they saw as heretics and not orthodox. They saw as challenging the orthodoxy of halakha. And the main voice of the heretics in medieval times were the Karaites. So Karaites who were committed to doing God's word, following the written Torah, and doing Karaite practices, rejected the oral law, came along, Ibn Daud, early 12th century, and Maimonides later into the 12th century, and emphasized, no, that is actually heretical Judaism. The Orthodox Judaism and the binding Judaism is the one that not just has the written law, but has a perfect chain of transmission, either 40 generations according to Maimonides, or a different count according to Ibn Daud, but with the same punchline. Yes, somebody had a question?
Yes.
Yes.
I have a question. So one of the reasons all of this debate is going on is that people are doubting if it's oral as opposed to written, the sanctity of it. And
Yeah,
number
they're
two,
saying that this oral, what makes it binding?
well, the other thing is the oral is supposed to be taken off the written. I mean, the oral is an embellishment of the written. It's like the Constitution and the statute. So how could the oral have as much validity as the written?
That's exactly the question they're trying to answer. They're trying to say that the oral law is just as binding because it was all part of the original revelation. That's exactly what they're saying. They're saying it's not just that the written is binding and then everybody could, just very loosely, it's not this Protestant idea of sola scripta, again, just a simplified version where everybody has a text and interprets it. That's not what is going on in Rabbinic Judaism. In Rabbinic Judaism, there's a written 5 books of Moses and the 19 remaining books of the Bible. And then there's an oral tradition, which Maimonides and even Daoud are emphasizing. It is grounded in revelation also. And we could actually show exactly how it's transmitted. Or if you used legal terminology, it's binding precedent. This is binding precedent because this was transmitted from the beginning. It's not just, this is originalist also. This was all there and it was transmitted. That's what they're saying. Now, I want to move that from the medieval. Karen, yeah, please, if you want to add a comment.
They're not saying that the rabbis and the elders and the prophets took the oral law and somehow interpreted it until it was finally put down into the Mishnah. They're saying that everything that was transmitted over these 40 generations is the exact word of what was given down.
Yeah, that's what they're saying here. And you're asking a good question, Karen, which I don't want to get totally into. Whether that's the only, do they mean that literally? Is that the only way to think about it, et cetera? You're asking good questions. I mean, maybe I stopped you, but I get the direction you're heading in. And maybe you're somewhat skeptical or have questions and all that, or wonder whether there are other accounts. I don't want to get totally there because that's going to derail us from where I want to go. But it's a good question. All I would say, Karen, I just want to be clear. What I would say is Ibn Daoud and Maimonides here, by and large, are saying that. Part of what I'm hinting is there's a rhetorical reason for them to say that. There's a polemical reason to say that. And what you say in a polemic is not necessarily the full story. So what they're saying polemically might not be their only thoughts on the question, but they might think for polemical reasons, let's simplify. And let's just say the following, because the alternative of leaving it to Karaites who are just going off in their own directions, that's totally undermining the integrity of a system that's developed over centuries. That's my shorthand sort of response, but you're touching on important issues. So I hope everybody's with me one more time because we've done a fair amount. I just want to summarize where we are. We began with the beginning of Pirkei Avot. The beginning of Pirkei Avot has a chain of transmission. It talks about how the Torah, which seems to be the written and oral Torah, passed from Moses all the way to the men of the Great Assembly and Simon the Just. And what we've done so far is just fast forwarded to medieval times. And we saw in late Gaonic, early medieval times, that the beginning of Pirkei Avot looms large and actually is fleshed out by Maimonides, 40 generations, by Ibn Daoud, an entire book on this theme of how the tradition passed and was transmitted. And then you have to wonder, why is it so significant? And here I'm basically saying they live in a world where there is a significant minority voice of heretics, in their own opinion, heretics, who are rejecting that the Mishnah and Talmud and Halakha is binding. And those are the Karaites, okay? That's what we've said so far. Now, what I want to do, though, is go back. I want to go back to Pirkei Avot. I want to go back to the 2nd century CE, when we have, in other words, 200 CE, the beginning of Pirkei Avot, and I want to try to think or actually share some scholarship to ask the following question. Why does Pirkei Avot emphasize the theme of the chain of transmission? Why is that important of Pirkei Avot? Or another way, are there sort of polemics back in the 2nd century CE, not just in medieval times? Maybe Pirkei Avot is also engaged in a polemic, not against Karaites. There aren't Karaites in the 2nd century CE. Karaites are only around the year 1000. But there are other maybe polemics in the 2nd century CE. So here, I want to share some scholarship. Some of it is very ingenious. Some of it is ingenious but questionable, but it's certainly interesting. So let's share some scholarship. So before the scholarship, I want to introduce this is more important than interesting scholarly theories. I want to make sure people know of this. There is a book called Avot de Rabbi Natan. Okay? And this might be less familiar to some of you. Avot de Rabbi Natan. And Avot de Rabbi Natan is a parallel work to Pirkei Avot. And it's much longer. One of the things that's a little confusing, and I'll just say it briefly, we actually have two different versions of Avot de Rabbi Natan. Okay, and one of the brilliant scholars at Hebrew University wrote his doctorate on the two different versions. Okay, but we won't get into those intricacies here. What I do want everybody to know, and hopefully this will make some of you curious and you'll open it up. When you study Pirkei Avot, that great work, Ethics of Sayings of Our Fathers, Ethics of Our Fathers, there's a parallel book called Avot of Rabbi Natan. Let's leave why it's called Avot de Rabbi Natan, all of that. But it's it's sort of almost a midrash or an elaboration on Pirkei Avot. And it has all sorts of ideas that aren't in Pirkei Avot, but it begins with Pirkei Avot. So here, just to get a taste of Avot de Rabbi Natan, here, let's just see certain excerpts from the opening chain of transmission according to Avot de Rabbi Natan. By the way, a question you might right away ask is, when should we date Avot de Rabbi Natan? All these things are huge scholarly debates. Okay, again, in the Beis Midrash, they don't ask these types of questions when to date it, but scholars are curious, so it's huge debates. But probably it's a little later, or maybe even more than a little later than Pirkei Avot. So let's look at the beginning. Sorry, the Torah that the Holy Blessed One he gave to Israel was given only through Moses. Then Joshua received from Moses. Then the elders received from Joshua. And then here's the new line. Judges received from Joshua, right? That's not in our beginning of Pirkei Avot. This adds, in addition to Zkenim and Nevi'im, elders, prophets, it adds Shoftim, judges. And then it has Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi received from the prophets. And then the Great Assembly, Anshe Knesset Agdola, received from Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So that's also an addition. Does everybody see that the beginning of Avot de Rabbi Natan, again, this parallel work to Avot, also a work of the rabbis, probably a little bit later, has some additional material that's not in Pirkei Avot, in the chain of transmission. And what are the two additions here? Judges and Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Okay, so what I want to just show, I just want to make one comment, that when Maimonides starts to fill out the beginning of the chain of tradition, or chain of transmission, he's actually continuing a tradition that's an old tradition, because already Avot de Rabbi Natan starts to fill in the chain in the beginning of Pirkei Avot. Now, I want to turn to scholarship. So here we have the scholarship of two figures, Louis Finkelstein and Elias Bickerman. These were both giants of scholarship of the 20th century. Louis Finkelstein was a very well-known figure from Jewish Theological Seminary. He was a brilliant Talmudist, prolific, and wrote many, many things. That's what prolific means, of course. A lot of what he wrote, scholars today have questions about. So just because he was brilliant and prolific doesn't mean that he had the final verdict on every question he addressed, but he certainly was a great scholar of rabbinic literature. Elias Bickerman is a really fascinating figure. By the way, Bickerman, there's a whole biography of Bickerman worth reading. He was a legendary classicist at Columbia University, and he knew a ton about everything in the ancient world, including having fascinating things to say about Judaism. Although he was not, and he writes about this, he was not in command of Hebrew firsthand in the way he was of other ancient languages, but still he had a lot of interesting things to say. So here, there's a bit of a debate between Finkelstein and Bickerman. I'm not sure either is totally convincing, but I still want to try to tonight share both Finkelstein and, if I can, Bickerman also. So Finkelstein makes the following argument. Let's see it, at least a part of it. He says the following. This is actually Bickerman recapping the theory of Finkelstein. As Finkelstein notes, this number is not accidental. I apologize that I'm jumping in the middle, but I don't want to bring you the whole article. This number means 14. Finkelstein wants to argue that if you look at Avot of Rabbi Natan, again, we just saw a few steps in it, but he says if you look at all the steps, according to Avot of Rabbi Natan, there actually are 14 steps. We saw Maimonides talks about 40 steps. We saw Ibn Daud talks about 38 steps, but those are later medieval works. If you go back to Pirkei Avot, you don't have 14. But if you look at Avot of Rabbi Natan, says Finkelstein, if you count it, you'll see there are 14 steps or links in the chain of transmission. According to Finkelstein, this number is not accidental. Then he notes that in Christian writings in the New Testament, in the first gospel, the genealogy of Jesus is made up of 3 chains, each of which has 14 links. Then he says, if you look in the book of Chronicles, Divrei Hayamim, the chronicler counts 14 high priests from Aaron to Azariah, the first high priest in the temple of Solomon, and then 14 successors of Azariah down to Yadua. Okay, so again, this is not so important, but because I'm reading it, I just want everybody to follow. What Finkelstein wants to argue is that the beginning of Pirkei Avot, once we look at the parallel of Avot of Rabbi Natan, we'll find 14 steps from Moses down to the rabbis. And Finkelstein argues 14 is not a coincidence. There's also 14 in the New Testament. And more importantly for Finkelstein, there's also 14 generations in the book of Divrei Hayamim of Chronicles when they're talking about the genealogy of high priests, of the high priests, beginning from the first in the times of Shlomo down to the end of the list. But here's the key point that Finkelstein wants to emphasize, not just 14, 14, 14, nice, same numbers. What he wants to say is in Pirkei Avot, there's a substitution. What's the substitution? Last 3 lines. But it's precisely these parallels that allows us to grasp the novelty of the Pharisaic chain, meaning of Pirkei Avot and of Avot of Rabbi Natan, which substitutes the professorial lineage from master to pupil for the natural descent from father to son. I want to make sure everybody understands it's a little scholarly speak, but here's the key point. This is the key thesis that Finkelstein wants to emphasize. Let me back up for a second and then we'll get back to what he says here. Finkelstein is a little bit troubled with this question, and so is Bickerman, the following question. The question is, where does the idea of giving a list of master and student come from? Because that is the beginning of Pirkei Avot. The beginning of Pirkei Avot talks about Moshe, right, as a type of master or teacher, right? Moshe receives the Torah and teaches it to Joshua, transmits it, but no doubt transmits it. What's the relationship of Joshua and Moses? It's disciple and master, right? It's basically a relationship of teacher-student, right? You could say leader to leader, but it's basically teacher to student. So the beginning of Pirkei Avot is basically, so wants to argue Finkelstein, and Bickerman, on this they agree. It's basically listing master, student, teacher, disciple, right? Great teacher, great disciple, great teacher, great disciple. And it's true, we have shorthand, Joshua, elders, prophets, but that's why if you look and it's fleshed out, you'll see a little bit more. And argues Finkelstein, that's what's listed in the beginning of Pirkei Avot. Now Finkelstein's bothered, where did the rabbis get that idea that there's that standing of teacher and student? It's a very rabbinic idea, of course, but you know, what's going on? So argues Finkelstein, actually what the rabbis in the beginning of Pirkei Avot are doing is they're making a substitution. The substitution is from the family model of priests to the master-pupil model of the rabbis. In other words, they're transitioning or replacing the relationship of high priest to next high priest, which is a relationship of family, right? Descent father to son, but from priest to priest. And they're replacing that with what matters most in the world of the rabbis. Rabbis care less about the family. Of course, they care about family values, but they care less. What gives standing in the rabbinic world is who is the Talmid Chacham, who is the great student of the master, who's the great pupil of the master. And Moses is a master and Joshua is his pupil. And that's replacing the model of priests. That's the argument of Finkelstein. Now, you don't need to totally go with Finkelstein. Others have said a similar idea. And let me just say the way others have said it. Others have made the following fascinating argument about the beginning of Pirkei Avot, which again, I'm presenting it for people to think it over, whether it is convincing or not. Everybody should be their own judge and jury. But they point out the following. Let's go back to the beginning of Pirkei Avot. This is similar to Finkelstein, but he has his own version. But they say the following. In the beginning of Pirkei Avot, they make the following argument. Moses received Torah, gave it to Joshua, Joshua to elders, elders to prophets, prophets to men of great assembly. And they make the argument, who's missing? Who's missing? And the argument that various scholars have made, this is actually a very well-known argument in scholarship, that the missing group in Pirkei Avot, if we want to say one group, it's the priests. The priests are absent. Where are the priests in the beginning of Pirkei Avot? And scholars argue their absence is not accidental or coincidental, it's deliberate. I just want to try to sharpen that argument. Why there's something to that argument, because you could say, I don't know, a lot of people are missing. Why just talk about priests? But priests are pretty significant in terms of responsibility of the Torah. And just to bring the point home, let's just look at a verse from Deuteronomy. The verse from Deuteronomy says, Moses wrote down the law, and who did he give it to? There's actually an explicit verse in Deuteronomy. And he gave it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, and to all the elders of Israel, right? So there's an explicit verse in the Torah who talks about who Moses transmitted the Torah to. And he transmitted it to the priests. In light of this, this seems to sort of sharpen that insight, or at least that argument. And the argument is that Pirkei Avot, its beginning chain of transmission, is bypassing the priests. And the argument of scholars is that that is deliberate. It's always hard to know if something is deliberate, but once you look at the verse in Deuteronomy, I think that makes the argument a bit stronger. I want to,
Rabbi.
yes.
There
Oscar,
is
please.
here
Doctor.
in Deuteronomy,
Yeah.
it says the written. It's clearly
That's
the
true.
Written, while in Pirkei Avot, it is transmitting the lineage of the oral.
That is true. That is true. So again, I appreciate that, because I said I really want people to be the judge and the jury. It's true. The context here is the written Torah. It's not the oral law. Again, the 5 books of Moses aren't explicit about the oral law. So the question, it's an interesting suggestion. The suggestion is maybe the priests are scribes or something. I'm adding a little bit. Maybe they're, recipients or guardians of the written, but not the oral. The oral should go for, I'm adding a little bit. Maybe the oral should go to the great disciple. So that's plausible. But again, it's sort of hard to, the pushback, let me just say what I think the counter argument would be. The counter argument would be, if the priests, not just in this verse, but in other places, are designated as the lead teachers. Another verse in Deuteronomy 33, Yoru mishpatecha leYaakov, that the Levites and the priests should teach the laws. So presumably that means the written and the oral, at least the way the rabbis understand it. So it's sort of, I still think that would be the scholarly pushback. The scholarly pushback would be that the divide between written and oral law is inconsistent with the rabbis. The rabbis would say they go together. So if we trust the priests over the written law, then we should trust the priests over the oral law too. And then their absence in the beginning of Pirkei Avot is sort of notable. So should we build a whole Megillah out of it? Some scholars do, and others are, again, there. By the way, there was an article I want to mention, actually, it's important, that I read tonight, some scholarship of a friend of mine who wrote a lot on Pirkei Avot and a lot of nice things, and I want to give him credit and recommend to read him. His name is Amram Tropper, and he is a professor at Ben Gurion University. And he recently wrote an article where he pushed back on this priestly absence hypothesis. I read it. I'm not sure I totally was convinced with his argument, to be honest, but he made some interesting points. I want to go one step further because I'm trying to use this to introduce you to scholarship and interesting ideas, but also texts that might be less familiar to you. So here's a text that is important to know in its own right, I would argue, and also related to the chain of transmission, but also I think links up with this question of the role of priests or whether they're absent in the beginning of Pirkei Avot. And I'll get to that in a minute, the priest point, but let me just give me just a couple of minutes to introduce this text, just briefly. It requires a lot of time. The text is Ben Sira. And here is a painting of Ben Sira. Ben Sira is, maybe some of you know about Ben Sira. That's great. Maybe some of you have heard of Ben Sira according to the rabbis. The rabbis in some place are very critical of Ben Sira. They actually treat it as like forbidden study. So I apologize because the rabbis in some place, say you shouldn't study Ben Sira. What's odd is if you open Ben Sira, it's really just filled with wise sayings that are pretty pious. It's not so clear. It's a bit of a mystery to scholars why the rabbis were so, in some places, so against Ben Sira. The irony is in some places, the rabbis themselves quote Ben Sira. So probably there wasn't one view among the rabbis about Ben Sira. But either way, Ben Sira is an early work. By early, I mean, I think the approximate date, I should have double checked it, but I think scholars date it to 2nd century BC for a good reason, because I think we actually know in the very beginning of Ben Sira, his grandson has an introductory letter. Okay, but it's pretty easy to sort of roughly date it anyway for a reason we'll see in a second. So just what is Ben Sira very quickly? It's what I said. It's a book of wise sayings. It has 50 chapters of wise sayings. If we want to compare it to a book in the Bible, it's most similar. It imitates most the genre of the book of Mishlei, of Proverbs. This is 2nd century BC. 2nd century BC is already later than the Bible, right? The very last book of the Bible, according to scholars, is the book of Daniel, which also is around 2nd century BC. So it really is like at the very tail end of the Bible. But 2nd century BC, let's just be clear, is about 300-400 years earlier than the at least editing of the Mishnah. So this is a very ancient work, right? We're talking about almost 2300 years, an ancient book. Okay, so what does this have to do with Pirkei Avot? Here's because it seems to be earlier than Pirkei Avot. So here's the very interesting thing. I said it has wise sayings. By the way, that already reminds us a little of Pirkei Avot, because Pirkei Avot has ethics or wisdom, right? That's the genre of Pirkei Avot. If you had to compare Pirkei Avot to a book in the Bible, you probably would say Pirkei Avot is a little bit similar to the book of Proverbs, right? By the way, there's all sorts of scholarship. What is the genre of Pirkei Avot? And I don't want to get so caught up, but I'm just saying in a very general sense. Pirkei Avot is less halacha, it's more wise saying or ethics, which is sort of like Mishlei and Proverbs, which also reminds us of Ben Sira. Now, Ben Sira, okay, by the way, this is all interesting, I hope, in its own right, but then I'll get back to the priests. So Ben Sira has wise sayings, but the last 5 chapters, from chapter 45 till chapter 50, Ben Sira shifts gears, and they're very interesting. And again, you could Google this, and you could read some of it, or just skim it if it's interesting to you. So the end of of Ben Sira, the last 5 chapters, look what I have here. Excerpts from chapter, already from 44 through 50, so the last 7 chapters, I apologize. Look at the way it begins, and I'm just giving us very little excerpts. Let us now sing the praises of famous men, our ancestors in their generations. Very interesting. In the 2nd century BC, Ben Sira shifts gears towards the end. He doesn't begin this way. He ends the book this way. And he says, I want to tell you the heroes of each generation, basically, the famous men, the ancestors, right? Not just Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He wants to give you the great men. And he begins with, you see here, Enoch. That's very interesting. Basically, just after Adam, right? I don't remember whether he mentions Adam. I listed what, maybe if it skips Adam, that's odd. But he goes right after Adam. He's in the book of Genesis. Chanoch, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Aaron, Phineas, Joshua, Caleb, Judges, Nathan, David, Shlomo, Rechava, Miravam, Eliyahu, Elisha, Cheskiyahu, Yeshayahu, Yoshiyahu, Yirmiyahu, Yecheskel, the 12 prophets, Zerubbabel, Yoshua, the high priest Nehemiah. And by the way, where does he get at the very end? The leader of his brothers and the pride of his people was the high priest Simon. Shimon. Who is Shimon that he ends the book with in the 2nd century BC? This seems to be who? Any guesses? He starts with basically pre-Moshe. Then he gets through Moshe. Then he goes all the way these generations, all the biblical heroes, and he ends with somebody in his close to his lifetime in Second Temple periods named Shimon. Who's that? Any guesses?
Shimon HaTzadik?
Shimon HaTzadik. Is everybody with me? I want to make sure everybody follows because this is very interesting. The beginning of Pirkei Avot. I apologize that I didn't write this one line. I should have. But the beginning of Pirkei Avot, let's review it outside. Moshe, Joshua, then from Joshua to elders, elders to prophets, prophets to great assembly, Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, men of the great assembly. And the first figure we hear named, once we've shifted into elders, prophets, and men of the great assembly, the remnant of the men of the great assembly is Shimon. Shimon HaTzadik Hayam Mishayarei Knesset Hagdolah. Simon the Just. And how does Ben Sira in the 2nd century BCE, which is around the time of Simon the Just, end his list of ancestors? He begins with the book of Genesis all the way through Moses, and he ends with Shimon. And most scholars think this is the same Shimon because he's talking about Shimon, the luminary of the 2nd century BC. Presumably, that's the same Shimon. Now, I just want to go back and emphasize one interesting point. How does he describe Shimon here in this last? Shimon, son of Elias, but what else does he emphasize? Very clearly. What does he call him? What does he call him here in this last line? Leader of his brothers, part of his people was the
Priest.
high priest Shimon. The high priest Shimon. And in the beginning of Pirkei Avot, Shimon is just called Shimon HaTzadik. We're not even told that he's a high priest. which works well with the scholarly theory, being that in the beginning of Pirkei Avot, we don't care if you're a priest or not. That's not really what's important. What's important is master and disciple. Master and disciple. So let me just summarize what we have. Okay, and then I see there's a hand. Let me take the hand if somebody wants to ask, and then I'll summarize. Somebody want to ask? See a hand? Okay, so I'll summarize. And if you have a question or a comment, please ask. Again, my point is not to say this is 100% convincing or clear or all of that. My point is to share scholarly theories that I think are interesting, and maybe that we study the great Pirkei Avot, and maybe we miss some of this stuff. So whether this is right or wrong, I don't know. We leave it. There's a reason why scholars have been debating this for a while, because it's hard to prove. But the scholarly theory, again, well, I'm reviewing, and I'm also trying to highlight some issues that interest scholar beyond this one theory, and also to review the point of Ben Sira. I'm going to review everything I did very quickly. What I did tonight was I began with the beginning of Pirkei Avot, the chain of transmission. And what I showed is that in medieval times, the chain of transmission is elaborated on by Maimonides for 40 generations. By Ibn Daud, who lives a little bit before Maimonides, he actually writes an entire book. And I asked the question, why? Why are they elaborating so much? And I said, at least Ibn Daud shows his cards. Because Ibn Daud says, there are Karaites who live around me who reject the rabbinic halacha. So I am responding to them and showing that rabbinic halacha is not happenstance, and it's not just a human creation, and it's not just the quirk of history. It is a perfect chain of transmission that we have the exact lineage of, and we know the exact chains in the link. And I suggested, and along with scholars, that maybe Maimonides has a similar thing in mind when he talks about 40 generations of perfect chain of transmission. That was the first thing we talked about. Then I want to use that to go back to Pirkei Avot itself and ask, does Pirkei Avot also have some hidden polemics within Pirkei Avot? That's one question I want to ask. I used that to make progress on that question. I also sort of introduced the second scholarly question, which is, where does Pirkei Avot come from? How do we know that there's such standing for master and disciple? Now, to us, this seems pretty intuitive. But the truth is, the Bible, while you could find, of course, some passages in Proverbs and elsewhere that talk about wisdom and teaching, but we don't hear of that standing in such an explicit way. We might see certain biblical stories as related. I'm not saying it's not between the lines, but certainly not spelled out so clearly. And this bothered some scholars, at least. And I quoted these two scholars that anyway are just interesting to know their names: Louis Finkelstein and Elias Bickerman. Louis Finkelstein had the following theory. I didn't really get a chance to get to Bickerman's alternate theory, but Louis Finkelstein had the theory. By the way, Bickerman didn't like Finkelstein's theory. Finkelstein's theory was that actually, if you look at Pirkei Avot, but you look at its parallel version, which is a little later and a little bit longer, which is Avot, the Rabbi Natan, which again, this everybody should know, at least that it exists. In addition to Pirkei Avot, there's a rabbinic work that's a elaboration called Avot the Rabbi Natan. If you look at Avot the Rabbi Natan, you have a longer a chain of transmission, more chains in the link, more links in the chain, more links in the chain. Comes along Finkelstein and he says, actually, there are 14 links in the chain. And Finkelstein argues there's also in one place in Divrei Hayamim a list of 14 high priests. And then Finkelstein wants to say that's the sleight of hand of Pirkei Avot. Pirkei Avot is substituting from the family model of priests, of father and son of priests in the high priesthood, which was transmitted through birthright, to the model of authority of Pirkei Avot, which is master and disciple. so argues Finkelstein again. There are a lot of people who don't agree with the details of his 14 and all of that. But what is more popular among some is the idea of a sort of a substitution or a replacement of priests, high priests, etc. And here I went on and I said that scholars point out that in the beginning of Pirkei Avot, we're missing the priests. We have Moses, we have Joshua, we have elders, we have prophets. In Avot Rabbi Natan, we had judges, but we don't have priests. And the question is that just, okay, they're between the lines, they're also obviously apart, or is that a deliberate omission? So here, I just want to thicken the case or give a little bit more background why it might be deliberate. So I could have brought more sources, but I try to give two sources, different kind of sources that I think help support that scholarly theory that Pirkei Avot is less interested in priests. It's not that I don't want to make like Pirkei Avot is anti-priest. That's too strong. But I want to say Pirkei Avot is saying the center of halacha and of transmission and of Judaism. It's less focused on priests. It's focused on the masters and the students and less on priests. And just to show that they might be missing, first I showed in a verse of Deuteronomy that Moses hands the Torah to the priests. Interesting exchange we had. Is it about the written Torah or written Torah, but why should oral be different? So there's a verse, Moses hands it to the priest. Maybe from that verse, we would think priests should be center stage in Pirkei Avot, and they're not. And then I introduced, this was towards the end, another text that anyway I want you to be aware of. I'm encouraging for you to at least, even if you move on to other and focus on rabbis, great, I'm all for rabbis, but at least you should be aware that there's this interesting book in the expanded Jewish library called Ben Sira. Rabbis, again, seem to have mixed feelings about Ben Sira, but it was a book written by a proud Jew in the 2nd century BC. And what's interesting about Ben Sira, and here we just emphasize this just on its own, that Ben Sira does seem to share certain similarities with, on the one hand, the biblical book of Proverbs, and on the other hand, Pirkei Avot. What are the similarities? That the content of Ben Sira is wise sayings, which is the content of the biblical book of Proverbs, and also the content of Pirkei Avot. Moreover, Ben Sira, 2nd century BC, several hundred years at least before the editing of Pirkei Avot, like Pirkei Avot, has several chapters. This is like Pirkei Avot, emphasizes what we see here. The ancestors, the heroes over the generations. And Pirkei Avot has a short list. Here it's a longer list. And here it's less clearly master-disciple, but there's a list of the heroes. Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, through Moshe. By the way, interesting, then Aaron, right? Some people emphasize that that's missing in the beginning of Pirkei Avot. Why Moses to Joshua and not Moses, Aaron? Okay, so that's another point that some scholars emphasize. But here in this list, you have Aaron. And by the way, who do you have after Aaron? Pinchas. And who's at the end of the chain? All the way to a hero of the 2nd century BCE, Shimon, but emphasized here as Shimon Kohen Gadol. A lot of scholars think Shimon Kohen Gadol of the 2nd century BCE is the same as Shimon HaTzadik of Pirkei Avot. But that's also interesting because in Ben Sira, the emphasis is on his being a high priest. And that's why Ben Sira also emphasized Aaron and Pinchas, other high priests. He's emphasizing, and Yoshua, high priest, and Shimon, high priest. And this, in a sense, highlights the absence of the emphasis on priest in the beginning of Pirkei Avot. Because even when we encounter Shimon, we don't know he's Shimon Kohen Gadol. We know he's Shimon HaTzadik. By the way, there are famous Agadot, legends that talk about Shimon as a Kohen Gadol, but not in the beginning of Pirkei Avot. Because apparently Pirkei Avot cares about master and disciple, and cares, at least some scholars would argue, less about priests. Okay, I got about halfway through what I wanted to, but I think my time's up. I would love to, find a time to do a part 2, but I don't want to go too long tonight because that's not fair. So I'm going to leave it at that. If anybody has questions, I'll stick around. Any questions or comments or arguments?
I had a question in the chat about, isn't this a Pharisee versus Sadducee?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that was the next place I wanted to go. Gilad asks, and this really next time I just want to elaborate more, that maybe the point is less about priest, non-rabbi, and more about rabbis linked to Pharisees and priests linked to Sadducees. And that there's certainly reasons to say that. Okay, that's a little, if you're familiar, that makes a lot of sense. If you're less familiar, that's fine, but maybe that's confusing. I'll just say a word. A lot of the Sadducees were very priestly. Doesn't mean Pharisees. We see ourselves as Pharisees linked to rabbis. Rabbis, of course, I want to be clear. I'm not on this like polemic against priests. I'm just saying I think the rabbis for sure respect priests and talk about priests, and priests are in the world of rabbis, but they don't seem to have a separate status in the world of rabbis beyond their halachic status that they get called as Kohen and other things. I'm not saying priests aren't important. They're important, but they're not distinct from other Talmidei Chachamim. What's in terms of their authority vis-a-vis Torah? What gives you standing in the world of rabbis is knowledge of Torah, not whether you're a priest or not. That seems to be less important in the world of the rabbis. So just back to the point. So sure, in the world of rabbis and the world of Pharisees, they're priests, but they're also non-priests. But in the world of the sects, like the Sadducees very much emphasize there being a sect of priests. Even the word Sadducee comes from the word Tzadok, and Tzadok was a name of a high priest. So what Gilad is asking is, maybe it's less rabbis replacing priests as Pharisees marginalizing or polemicizing with the priestly Sadducees. And there's more to say about that. That certainly is plausible. There's also some scholars who reject that for various reasons. So please God, if I do a part 2, I'll try to talk more about that. Any other comments or questions?
Yes. So this Pirkei Avot is the first book of the Mishnah. It's
it's not the first book of the Mishnah. It's a very interesting question.
Where is it?
It comes in, excellent question. And Karen, I just want to emphasize one thing. It doesn't come in the beginning. It comes in the middle. And that is something I said in passing. I said, some people ask, why didn't the beginning of the Mishnah begin with the beginning of Pirkei Avot? Because it seems to be a great intro. And I don't have a great answer to that question. But just to answer your question, where does it appear? Pirkei Avot appears, there are 6 orders of the Mishnah. And the 4th order is Nizikin, which is about tort law and civil law and damages. It appears there. It's a very interesting question. Why does it appear there? Because it seems to be wise sayings. It doesn't seem to be about tort law. So that's a question that scholars work on. Maybe if I have time to do more lectures on this, I could try to talk more about it.
One other thing, just to throw a monkey wrench into this, because I'm a lawyer.
Go for it.
If there's a dispute between all these Chacham, Maimonides, Nachmanides, whoever that other guy, Nathan, about how many generations it was passed on, wouldn't that cast doubt about the authenticity? I mean, some people say 40, some say 44. If they don't even know who it was passed on to, how can you vouch to the validity of what each of these entities was passing it on to?
Yeah.
I'm just throwing a monkey wrench into it.
No, it's a good question. First of all, I just want to be clear. There's not necessarily a debate because when even the Ud said 38, he said it's 38 from Chagai Zechari Malachi, which is in the Second Temple times around, let's say, 5th, 4th century BC, up until his time in the 11th century CE. So he's counting a different period of time than Maimonides. Maimonides is talking about from Moses till the end of the Talmud. So they're not talking about the same periods of time. That being said, I think ultimately you're right. That if we went through the calculus of each one, they're not going to be perfectly aligned. which probably shows what, to me, that probably supports what I at least here I'm with sort of the scholarly theory that they're less being scientific here. They're more polemicizing.
Right, I
And
got
they're
it.
polemicizing and they're trying to say, look, we have a list. Now, but just last point, I still hear in my ear, the great Maimonides, because the great Maimonides always would say, my list is right, all the others are wrong. So Maimonides would not really care that other people had other lists. He would say, theirs are wrong, mine's right. Because Maimonides had great confidence for very good reasons. But it's a good comment.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Ruth, Dr. Cohen, are you trying to say something? You're on mute.
Isn't it true that that this is oral tradition, not a list? Can you hear me?
Or the content of what they passed is oral, but there is an abbreviated list in the beginning of Pirkei Avot and a more fleshed out list in medieval times of who were the transmitters of the oral, who they were, what was their identity. I got to just add a word. I'm sorry.
The telephone game where one person says something to the next person, and by the time it gets to the bottom,
Yeah,
the final person, it could get a little bit mixed
it
up.
could get messy. I have to add another comparative religion point because it's important. Maybe next time I'll say it again if we do a part 2. But in Islam, which I'm certainly no expert on, but this is a very basic point in Islam. Islam, there's the Quran, and there's also the Hadith, and the Hadith are their oral traditions in Islam. Okay, this is both Sunni Islam and Shia Islam, but it's more, let's talk about Sunni just briefly. So in Sunni Islam, they have, in addition to the Quran, their written text, they also have oral traditions, Hadith. It's not so surprising because Islam, here I would say is sort of similar to the model of Judaism, which it came later than on this point, right? So in a hadith are all sorts of sayings and stories and other anecdotes, mostly revolving around the Prophet Muhammad. That's what hadiths are. And there are a lot of different collections of hadiths, okay, of oral traditions about Muhammad. And a religious Muslim sees these oral traditions as binding, not just what's in the Quran, but also what's in the hadith, oral traditions. What's fascinating is, I think every hadith, meaning every paragraph of oral tradition, which of course now it's no longer oral, they're written, but every paragraph begins with what's known as an isnad. I don't know if my pronunciation is right, but an isnad is a chain, and the chain of how we the Muslims who are saying this, let's get into their mindset, how they know this tradition about Muhammad. And it says literally, this is from Muhammad to the following, and they get from the 7th century CE till, let's say, the 9th century.
Like an email chain.
Yeah, but the point of it is not an email. The point is to substantiate
I got it. I know.
the tradition. That's the point. Now, this is interesting, and it reminds us of what's going on here, but clearly this is later, right? But it's imitating a little bit what's going on in the beginning of Pirkei Avot. And the idea is to give authority to a tradition.
Thank you.
Pirkei Avot is speaking much more in general, and so is Maimonides, and so is Ibn Dawood, about what gives authority to the entirety of what the rabbis are talking about. Okay? There's more to say on that.
Thank you,
but I'll
Rabbi.
leave it for now. Yeah, but I'd love to add more another time. So, any other comments or questions? I am enjoying the questions and comments. Phil, should I be looking at this now?
No, it's just a description of what
Okay,
you
good.
described.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, we should know more about our Muslim brothers and sisters. Okay, any other comments or questions? Good. So we will continue at another time. But next week, I'm going to go back to my Talmudic politics on Tuesdays at 7:30. And then at some point, if there's people want it, we'll do a part 2 of this. Okay, very good.
Thank you.
All right, good night.
Good night.